In 1897, 8 men walked out of a Kentucky hollow and never came back. They ran copper stills deep in the timber, where the roads had no names and the law never came. When the kin went looking, the fires were lit, the mash was set, and the worm was dripping clear liquor into a jar. Nothing was smashed, nothing was taken, and there was no blood, only coats on a branch and boots by the fire. The hollow never gave them back, and the strangest part wasn't the men, it was the stills still running, like they'd stepped away for a moment. There is a kind of silence that belongs to the Kentucky mountains and nowhere else, and if you've never stood in it, it's hard to say what it does to a person. It isn't the quiet of an empty house or a sleeping town. It's a heavier thing, dense and layered, the kind of quiet that seems to be listening back. The wind that comes down the ridgelines carries something on it that words don't fit, and the people who lived under it learned early not to talk about what they heard. A hollow in that country is a small valley with a creek running through it and only one way in. The walls are ridge on 3 sides, steep and wooded, and the floor is narrow enough that the morning sun doesn't reach it until nearly noon. People who grew up there call it a holler, and the name fits because the shape of the place holds sound the way a cup holds water. What goes in stays, and what's set inside it doesn't climb the walls. In 1897, the rest of the country was laying track and stringing wire and crowding into cities, but the southern Appalachians of eastern Kentucky were still a country apart. There were no paved roads in the hollows, only narrow tracks that turned to mud when the rain came and to ice when it didn't. A man could walk an hour to his nearest neighbor and a day to the county seat, and there were no telephones to shorten any of it. The maps drawn by people back east grew vague at the county line, and past that line the names on them were mostly wrong. Autumn came to those hollows the way a door closes, and by October of 1897 the ridges had already turned and the creek was running cold enough to ache your hands in it. The corn was in, the apples were down, and that was the season a man ran his stills hardest because the cold kept the mash from spoiling and the long nights gave cover for the smoke. A crew that meant to put up whiskey for the winter worked through October and into November without much rest, tending the fire in shifts and sleeping in their coats by the coals. The 8 men in this hollow were in the middle of that push the night they went, which is why the stills were lit at all and why the camp was full of men instead of 1 or 2. There is a kind of story the hollows only tell once they have given up trying to explain it, and this is one of those. The men were there, and then they weren't, and what they left behind didn't fit any shape the valley had a name for, which is why the telling of it has never stopped. The land in those hollows didn't forgive a careless man. The laurel grew so thick on the slopes that a body could lie 10 feet off the trail and never be found, and the creek beds dropped into sinkholes that swallowed water and whatever the water carried. A man who broke a leg a mile from home could die there before anyone thought to look, and the cold came down those ridges in October like something with weight behind it. People who stayed did it because the land was theirs, and because leaving would have meant admitting the land had won. The isolation wasn't an accident either. The men who ran stills chose hollows like this one because the shape of the ground did the hiding for them, and because the creek that ran the floor was the one thing a still couldn't do without. A still needed cold water, and a hollow with a creek had cold water. So the same feature that made the place impossible to find also made it possible to work. That trade is the whole reason anyone was in that hollow at all, and it's the reason 8 men were there the night they disappeared. The hollow where this story sits had a name the people outside it never learned, and the men who worked it had a habit of vanishing into the timber at odd hours that the women had stopped asking about. You didn't ask a moonshiner where he was going. You knew what he was doing, and he knew you knew, and the not saying was the whole agreement. A hollow like that kept its own counsel, and it kept their counsel too. And in the fall of 1897, it kept something else it has never given back. This is a story the mountains held onto for a long time, and the way it was told in the valleys is the way it's told here. It isn't a case file. There's no ledger with the names in it, and no sheriff's report in a courthouse drawer, because no sheriff was ever called, and no one ever wanted one. It's a legend, the kind the hollows pass down to explain a thing that resists explaining. And the only honest way to tell it is to say straight out that no one knows how it ends. What is known is the scene the men left behind, and that scene is the part that has never made sense. The men who worked that hollow were 8 in number, and most of them were kin or near kin, bound by the kind of loyalty that only shared illegal work can build. They weren't the cartoon hillbillies the city newspapers like to draw. They were skilled men, quiet men, good with copper and fire, and patient with a process that would kill a careless one. The oldest among them was a man the hollow called Asa, somewhere in his 40s, which in those hills was already a long life. He had run stills since he was a boy, watching his father hammer copper sheets, and the others deferred to him the way men defer to someone who has never burned a run. The rest of the crew ran from boys in their 20s to men Asa's age, and a couple of them were his own. There was a younger brother who could read a fire the way some men read a clock, and a cousin from the next ridge who came down for the fall run and stayed through the first frost. They worked in shifts because a still never sleeps while the run is on, and the night was when the best work happened, with the smoke low in the timber and the cold keeping the mash sharp. A man on the night stir sat the fire and watched the worm and listened to the hollow, because the hollow was where the warning came from, if it came at all. You kept your rifle lean and you kept your ears open, and you didn't let the fire get away from you. What they did wasn't a hobby, and it wasn't a vice. It was how a man in those mountains turned a hard year into a survivable one. The roads were too rough to get perishable crops to market in time, and ripe fruit spoiled on the wagon before it ever reached a buyer. So a farmer distilled his corn and his apples into whiskey instead. Whiskey kept, it traveled, and it was worth more by the gallon than the grain that made it. 3 bushels of dried corn, or 7 bushels of apples, would run through a still and come out as about 2 gallons of liquor, and 2 gallons of liquor bought what 10 bushels of corn never could. Even the slop left in the pot after the run went to the hogs, so nothing was wasted. The Scots-Irish who settled those ridges in the 1700s brought the craft with them, the way they brought their fiddles and their grudges, and by 1897 it was as ordinary in a hollow as planting. The still itself was a thing of beauty in a poor man's hands. They used a turnip still, named for the squatty turnip shape of its copper boiler, the pot, hammered and riveted and soldered together from copper sheets. A coiled copper tube called the worm curled inside a wooden box, the flake stand, that they kept full of cold creek water. The work began days before the fire, in the mash barrels, where they mixed ground corn, water, barley malt, and yeast and let it sit. Fermentation took 3 or 4 days, and in cool weather, corn mash could take 2 weeks to come ready. A foam called the cap rose on the barrel as it worked, and when that cap fell, what was left was a sour beer between 6 and 12% alcohol, and that was what went into the pot. Running it was the part that asked for a steady hand. They lit the fire under the pot and stirred the mash while it heated, nursing the temperature up toward the boiling point of alcohol, which is 173 degrees. Too hot and the mash scorched, or worse, it puked up into the cap and ran into the worm and ruined the run. When the temperature was right, they sealed the metal cap on top of the pot, and the alcohol vapor climbed through it and into the worm. The cold water in the flake stand condensed the vapor back to liquid, and it dripped out the end of the worm, the money piece, into a jar. The first run was rough stuff they called singlings, and a man who cared about his trade ran it through a second time to mellow it. That's why they were in that hollow, and that's why they needed the creek. The cold water was the condenser, and without it, the vapor stayed vapor, and the run was lost. A hollow with a spring-fed creek was the only place the work could happen, and the 8 men had picked this one because the water ran cold and the walls ran steep, and no one came down that track who wasn't invited. The night they disappeared, the stills were in the middle of a run, which is the one fact that matters more than any other in this story, and we'll come back to it. The work was illegal, and it had been illegal for longer than any of those men had been alive. The federal government put its first tax on whiskey in 1791, almost as soon as the country could stand up, and the frontiersmen who had just fought a war over taxes didn't receive the news well. They kept making their whiskey, and they kept ignoring the tax, and when the government sent men called revenuers to collect it, The reception was bad enough that some of those agents got tarred and feathered for their trouble. In 1794, the resentment boiled over into the Whiskey Rebellion, and President Washington called up 13,000 militiamen and marched them to Pittsburgh to put it down. That rebellion broke, but the stills didn't stop. And in Kentucky and Virginia and the Carolinas, they never really did. The tax came and went over the years, but it came back hard during the Civil War, and by 1865, it sat at $2 a gallon, which was as much as 12 times what it actually cost to make a gallon of liquor. That was the law still on the books in 1897, and it's the reason every still in that hollow was a federal crime. A man running a turnip still beside a creek wasn't bending a rule. He was dodging a tax that would have eaten his profit whole, and the government treated it accordingly. The men who enforced it were the revenue agents, and their job was to watch the legal distilleries and hunt the illegal ones. A raid went a certain way, and the Moonshiners knew it as well as the agents did. Someone talked, and the someone was often a rival bootlegger looking to clear a competitor, and the agents took the tip and watched the site for a while before they moved. When they moved, they came with axes or dynamite, and they smashed the pot and the worm and the flake stand so the operation couldn't run again. That was the whole point of a raid, to make the still unusable. The gunfights between moonshiners and revenuers had become the stuff of legend by then, though the raids themselves were usually quieter than the stories, and a man caught red-handed at his still often just took his lumps and went to jail. The word bootlegger came into use in the 1880s from the trick of hiding a flask in the top of a boot, and it marked the difference between the man who made the liquor and the man who moved it. The moonshiner was the maker, the bootlegger was the hauler, and in a hollow like this one, the same men did both when they had to. What matters here is what the code of silence cost, and the cost was this: you never called the law for anything. Law was the enemy, and the men who lived under it had built a whole way of staying invisible. They stretched thread across the paths into a still site, and a broken thread meant someone was there who shouldn't be. The thickets were kept trimmed so the canopy hid the smoke. They watched the ridges for riders, and the neighbors watched for them in return. You didn't ride to the county seat when trouble came, because the county seat was where the trouble lived. That's the seed of everything that follows. When 8 men vanished from a working still site in 1897, there was no one to call, and even if there had been, no one would have called them. The hollow handled its own, and the hollow's own were gone. The first one to know was a boy of 17, a nephew of Ace's, who came down the hollow at first light with a sack of meal on his shoulder and a turn at the stir expected of him. He was young for the work, but old enough to be trusted with the fire, and he'd made that walk 100 times in the dark without thinking about it. The track dropped into the laurel and followed the creek, and the first thing he should have heard was the sound of the run, the low hiss of the pot, and the tick of the worm dripping into the jar. He heard the tick, and he heard the creak, and he heard nothing else. The camp was wrong before he could say how. The fire under the big still was burning low, the way a fire burns when nobody has fed it for hours, and the mash in the pot was still warm and still working toward the temperature where the run would stall. Across the creek the second still was the same, its fire lit and its worm dripping, and the jar under the money piece was half full and still filling, drop by drop, with no hand there to swap it out. He set down the sack and stood in the middle of 2 stills running for nobody, and the quiet of it was a thing he never got out of his sleep. What was left behind was worse than what was missing. Coats hung on a low branch by the fire, 2 of them, still holding the shape of the men who'd worn them. Boots set by the coals, 3 pairs, set there to dry the way a man sets them when he means to put them back on. A plate of cornbread and cold fatback sat on a stump, half eaten, and a tin cup of coffee stood beside it, still warm to the touch when the boy picked it up. These aren't the things a man takes when he's leaving for good. These are the things a man leaves when he's stepping out for a minute and coming right back. There was no struggle anywhere in that camp. No blood on the leaves, no bullet marks in the poplars, no drag trail through the ash, and no saplings broken at chest height the way they break when men fight. Creek ran clear over the gravel, and the mud on both banks was unmarked except for the prints the men themselves had made coming and going all week. The rifles were still there, 4 of them, stacked against a poplar where the men had leaned them, and the dogs were still there too. The dogs were lying by the dead fire, calm and unhurt, and that's the detail the boy remembered longest, because a dog doesn't lie down through violence. A dog that has seen its men taken gets up and howls and runs the trail. These dogs just watched him, and one of them thumped its tail. He didn't search the timber, and he didn't follow the creek. He did what a boy raised in that hollow would do, which was to turn around and run back up the track as fast as he could, and not to look at the ridge lines until he reached the first kin house. By the time the sun was over the ridge, there were 6 men and 3 women standing in that camp, looking at 2 stills still running and 8 men who weren't there, and none of them could make the scene mean anything yet. The boy couldn't say when the men had gone, only that the coffee was warm and the jar was half full, which put it somewhere in the small hours of the night, and which put 8 men out of that hollow inside a window too narrow to believe. The kin read that camp the way a man reads a page, because they knew the work, and the work told them what the men had been doing when they stopped. A still left running is a still left mid-task, and a man who means to abandon a site doesn't leave it running. You bank the fire and you pour the beer off, or you lose the run, and you lose the copper too if you're gone for good, because copper left hot over a dead fire warps and splits. Fires here weren't banked, mash wasn't poured off, the jars were under the worms and catching, which means every man at that camp expected to be standing there an hour later to swap them. The timing narrowed it down to something almost impossible. Mash in the pot had cooled past its best run temperature, but not yet to a stall, which is an hour, maybe 2, after a man last stirred it. Coffee was warm but not hot, which is the same hour or 2 off the stove. The jar under the big still was half full, and a jar fills at a rate every one of those men knew by heart, which put the last tending somewhere in the dead middle of the night. Inside that window, 8 men, several of them armed, all of them within a few acres of each other, walked out of a working camp and left not one sound behind them. The objects told the same story the stills did, and they told it louder. Boots off, coats hung, food half eaten. You take your boots off when you're sitting down to rest at the fire, and you hang your coat when you're warm enough to do without it for a while. You don't do those things if you're running, and you don't leave a plate of food half eaten if you've been scared off it, because a scared man doesn't sit down to eat in the first place. Everything those men left behind was the furniture of a pause, the small, unthinking arrangements a man makes when he's coming right back to the same spot. The first reading the kin reached for was the easy one, and it died in their mouths as they said it. Maybe the men heard something in the timber and went to check it. A bear on the mash barrels, a pig in the corn, a thief working the creek. But the rifles were still stacked against the poplar. You don't go check a bear in the dark without a rifle, and none of these men would have, not once, and not 8 at once. The rifles being there meant the men hadn't left the camp for the timber on their own feet, or it meant something the kin weren't ready to say out loud yet. That one fact, the rifles still stacked where the men had leaned them, would bother the hollow for 100 years, and we're not done with it. The kin did what the hollow always did, which was to handle it themselves. By the second morning, there were men on every ridge around that camp, walking the spurs and the creek beds, reading the ground for a sign the way they'd read it since they were boys trailing deer. These were men who knew that timber the way a man knows his own yard, every sinkhole and every laurel thicket, and they went up the walls and down the creek and out along the spurs with dogs ahead of them. They found nothing. No body, no torn cloth on the briars, no boot print leaving the creek bed, no branch broken where a man had pulled himself up the ridge in the dark. The hollow itself was half the problem, because the hollow was built like a trap. One way in at the mouth where the boy had come down the track, and walls of steep ridge on the 3 other sides, with the creek as the only path along the floor. If 8 men had walked out under their own power, they had walked out past the camp and down the mouth of the hollow, or they had gone straight up a near cliff in the black of night. The first was impossible, because the boy had come up that track at dawn and seen no one. And the second was impossible, because no man climbs that ridge in the dark without leaving half his skin on the rock. No one rode to the county seat, and no one wanted to. There was no sheriff coming down that track, and no federal marshal, and no coroner, because the kin would sooner have cut off their own hands than sign the paper that brought the law onto a still site. They searched for days on their own time, and then for weeks in the odd hours around the farm work, and the hollow kept the men the way it kept the cold. The absence of any official record is the only record that survives, and it's exactly what you'd expect from a place that ran its whole life on the principle that the law never came and was never wanted. The mood in the hollow changed after that, and it changed for good. Work stopped, and nobody banked the stills properly, so they were left to burn dry, and the copper greened over where it sat. The creek kept running the way creeks do, indifferent to whatever had happened on its banks, and the cold came down the ridges, and the camp grew up in frost. People stopped using that branch of the hollow after dark, and they didn't say why, and they didn't have to, because everyone in those ridges already knew the shape of a place you don't go after the sun drops. The first theory the hollow settled on was the obvious one, which was that the law had taken them. The revenuers had been pressing the county harder that season, and a big raid could sweep up 8 men at a single site and march them out before the rest of the hollow knew what had happened. It fit the times, and it fit the enemy, and for a few days it was the story the kin told each other, because it was the story that had an end. It doesn't fit the scene, and the scene is the thing that won't bend. Revenuers destroyed stills. They came in with axes and dynamite, and they broke the pot and the worm and the flake stand, because the whole point of a raid was to make the operation unusable, and a still left whole was a still that would run again next week. The stills in that hollow weren't smashed. They were still running when the boy got there, with their fires lit and their worms dripping, and no raiding party in the history of revenue work left a crime scene mid-production and walked 8 men out of it without so much as denting the copper. And the rifles were still there. A raiding party that takes 8 armed moonshiners doesn't leave 4 rifles stacked against a tree. The revenuer theory broke on the rifles, and it broke on the stills, and once it broke, the hollow was left looking at a disappearance with no human hand they could name. With the law ruled out, the hollow turned to the explanations it knew from older trouble, and one by one they failed on the same 2 facts. There had been no struggle, and the stills had been left running. And any story that couldn't account for both wasn't a story that could stand. A feud was the first one they tried, because feuds were the language of those ridges, and a man knew how to read one. A rival family could bushwhack a still camp in the dark, and it had happened before within living memory. But a feud leaves a message, and a feud takes the still or burns it, because the point of a feud is to hurt and to claim. This camp was untouched, the whiskey was still dripping, and no message was left. Feuding men who wanted 8 men dead would have left the 8 men where they fell, not carried them off whole and left the rifles behind. The feud didn't fit. A flood was the next, and it almost worked, because the creek ran the floor of the hollow, and a storm could put it over its banks in an hour. Walls of water coming down that creek at night could take men off the gravel bar before they could stand, and the hollow had seen it carry off livestock more than once. But the camp was undisturbed. The fire was lit, the plate was dry on its stump, the coats hung on a branch a man could touch with his hand. A flood that takes 8 men off the creek doesn't leave a half-eaten plate of cornbread dry on a stump 3 feet above the waterline, and it doesn't leave the dogs lying calm by the coals. Creek bed showed no scour line above the bank, and the mud on the far side was unmarked. The flood didn't fit. A bear or a panther was the one the older men argued for, because the timber held both, and a panther in the dark could turn a man's blood to water. But a bear takes 1 man on a bad night, and a panther takes 1 man, and neither takes 8, and neither leaves the dog sleeping through it. The beast theory couldn't get past the number, and it couldn't get past the calm. Bandits or road agents were the last human option, and they failed on the simplest ground, because bandits take things. They take the whiskey, they take the copper, They take the rifles and the cash and anything they can carry out. Nothing in that camp was taken. The jar was still filling, the copper was still hot, and the rifles were still stacked where the men had left them. Every theory the Hollow could build broke on the same rock, and the rock was those two facts. No struggle, and the stills still running. This is where the rifles come back, because anything human enough to take 8 men out of a camp would have taken the guns or left a fight, and anything animal enough to take them would have left a body and a sound. The rifles still stacked against the poplar meant that whatever took those men wasn't a thing the Hollow had a name for, and once the kin admitted that, they stopped looking for people and started looking at the place itself. Pull back from the 8 men for a moment, because the Hollow they worked had a longer memory than any of them did. The old people in those ridges could name others who had gone the same way over the years, and the way they told it is how it's given here, as the valley remembered it, and not as a docket a clerk could check. There was a trapper who walked up that creek in the 1880s after a mink, and wasn't seen again, his traps found still set in the morning, and his dog come home alone. A preacher who went up the branch to sit with a sick family had his horse wander back to the gate that evening, the saddle empty and the reins dragging. There was a boy of 17 who followed a dog into the laurel after a rabbit, and the dog came back, and the boy didn't, and they searched for him for a week and never found the cap off his head. There was a timber cutter who went up the head of the Hollow one November to fell a poplar and was found at noon sitting against the tree he'd meant to cut, his axe still in his hand and his eyes open, dead of nothing anyone could name. The doctor who finally came up from the county seat could find no mark on him and no cause in him, and the family buried him with the question unanswered. That one was close enough to the 8 that the old men remembered it when the camp was found, and they remembered it because it was the kind of vanishing the Hollow had come to expect, a man going still in a place that didn't explain itself. Mark those as the oral tradition of the Hollow, and not as cases with a paper trail, because there's no paper trail, and there never was. They're the texture of the legend, the way the valley explained its own habits to itself, and they matter here because of the pattern they make. Old people had a name for the pattern, though they didn't say it loud. The Hollow took people, the way they told it, in 1s and 2s over the years, always the same, no body and no sign and no reason, and the family just had to absorb it and go on. The land in those ridges was full of that kind of vanishing, and everyone who lived there knew a family it had happened to, or knew a family who knew one. The difference in the fall of 1897 was the number, and the number is what pushed this story out of the Hollow and into the wider valley. 1s and 2s the Hollow could keep to itself, the way it kept everything. 8 at once was a different order of event, and 8 at once from a working still site, with the fires lit and the boots by the coals, was something the Hollow had never reached for before. The old men who heard the number went quiet, and the quiet of those old men is its own kind of evidence, because they were the ones who had spent a lifetime explaining the smaller vanishings away, and even they didn't try to explain this one. This is the country these stories live in, the place where the legend and the land are the same thing, and the only honest framing is to say that the Hollow had a habit of taking people, and that in 1897 it reached further than it ever had. Whether the land really takes people, or whether it only hides them better than any other ground in the country, is a question the Hollow answered one way and a map would answer another, and the gap between those two answers is where this story lives. Look at the land itself, because once the people were ruled out, the land was the only suspect left, and the land in that Hollow was built to keep a thing. Sound dies against those ridge walls the way a candle dies in a jar, and a man shouting from the floor of the Hollow could be unheard 30 yards up the slope, his voice swallowed by the laurel and the angle of the rock. The mist fills the floor at dusk, and it doesn't lift until mid-morning, and when it sits down there, a man can't see his own hand at the end of his arm. A voice carries wrong in that shape of valley too, so that a call seems to come from ahead when it comes from behind, and the men who grew up there knew better than to trust their ears after dark. The floor of that Hollow held the cold air while the ridges warmed, so that a man standing on the rim could look down into a bed of mist that looked solid from above and never thinned until nearly noon. Sound behaved the way the mist did, pooling in the low ground and refusing to climb, and a gunshot on the floor of the hollow could be a muffled thud up on the ridge, while a snapping twig on the ridge carried clean to the creek. A man who lived there learned to read that wrongness, and a man who didn't could walk into trouble his ears never warned him of. The terrain hides a body better than any grave a man could dig. Slopes are crossed with sinkholes where the limestone has dropped out from under the soil, and a man who steps wrong in the dark goes down, and the laurel closes over the hole, and the ground looks the same the next morning. There are old mine collapses up some of those spurs, worked out and abandoned before the war, and a man could fall into one of those, and the mountain would just keep him. The thickets of laurel and rhododendron grow so dense that a body 10 feet off the trail is a body no search will find, not in a week and not in a year, and the cold preserves what the laurel hides. The isolation did the rest, because there was no one to come looking in time. An hour to the nearest neighbor, a day to the county seat, no telephones and no roads, and a man could be gone a week before the world outside the hollow even knew to miss him. The search that mattered, the first hours, was always going to be the kin's search, and the kin's search was always going to be 8 or 10 men on foot in country that could hide an army. By the time anyone thought to widen the circle was already too wide, and the hollow had already closed. Old people kept a darker reading to themselves, and it's right to give it here as belief and not as fact. They believed some places don't give back what they take, and they believed this hollow was one of them, and they didn't say it where children could hear. That's a belief, not a measurement, and it's worth saying plainly that a man with a map and a geologist would give you a different answer, would talk about sinkholes and exposure and the difficulty of a ground search in that timber. Both answers can sit in the same hollow without canceling each other, and the people who lived there sat with both every day. The creek that fed the flake stand ran out of that same ridge, out of the rock the men had built their fires beside, and the water came out of the mouth of the place that took them. The kin noticed that, and they didn't fish that creek for a long time after. Come back to the morning the boy found the camp, because that scene is the one fact in this story that survives every retelling, and it's the one that deserves to be held and looked at slowly. The fire under the big still was burning low, the last of the wood gone to coal, and the mash in the pot was ticking as it cooled toward the temperature where the run would stall and the dripping would slow to nothing. Across the creek the second still was the same, its worm still trailing in the cold water of the flake stand, its jar catching the drip the way a jar catches rain off a leaf. 2 stills ran for no one in the gray light of a Kentucky morning, and not a man was in sight to tend them. Hold that image, because it's the whole story in one frame. A still running untended is a clock still counting after the room is emptied, and what it counts is the minutes since the men who lit it walked away. The mash cooling toward its stall is a clock running down, and the jar filling under the money piece is a clock running up. And between the two of them, they fixed the moment the men left to inside an hour or 2 of the boy's arrival. That's the closest thing to a voice the 8 men left behind, and what it says, if you let it say it, is that they stepped out and they meant to come back. This is the detail that defeats every theory the hollow ever built, and it's worth knowing why. A raid smashes the still, so a running still rules out a raid. Flight banks the fire, so a lit fire rules out a flight. Floodwater scours the bank and drowns the coals, so a dry plate and a low fire rule out a flood. A beast or a bandit leaves a sign or takes a thing, so an untouched camp rules out both. The one fact that every explanation has to get around is the stills running, and the one thing no explanation has ever gotten around is the stills running. Strip everything else away and what you have is 2 fires lit, 2 worms dripping, and 8 men who were there to tend them and then weren't. There's an image the kin carried out of that hollow and carried for the rest of their lives, and it's the one that ends this part of the story. The jar under the big still filled past its rim while they stood there, because no one had come to swap it, and the clear liquor spilled over the top and ran down the glass and soaked into the ash of the dead fire. The creek kept running the way it always had, and the stills kept running the way they would until the fire died, and the men didn't come back, and the jar kept spilling, and that's the last thing the hollow had of them. The kin never found the men, and they never called the law, so there was no record of any of it anywhere but in the telling. Stills burned dry where they sat, and the copper turned green and then black, and nobody hauled them out because nobody wanted to go down that branch and handle them. The camp grew up in laurel inside a couple of seasons, and the poplar where the rifles had been stacked rotted at the base and fell across the creek, and the creek just ran around it. Within 10 years there was nothing to mark where the camp had been, except a flat place by the water and a ring of old stones from the fire pit, and even those could have been anything. The story did what stories do in a place like that, which is that it hardened into legend. Those 8 men became the 8, a number the hollow used the way other places use a date, and you could say the 8 to anyone in those ridges and they would know which 8 you meant. Parents use the number to keep their children off that branch after dark, and they use the stills to explain why, because a child understands a fire still lit and no one standing by it. The detail that survived every retelling was never the men themselves, whose names went soft and then went uncertain, and then, in most tellings, went altogether. What survived was the jar that kept filling, and the boots by the coals, and the coats on the branch. Because those are the things a story can hold on to when the people in it have gone. State the absence plainly, because it's the one fact that hasn't moved in 120 years. No bodies, no bones, no clothing, no rifles. In all the time since, with men walking that hollow to hunt and to trap and to check the creek, nothing of the 8 has ever turned up. Not a button and not a bone and not a brass cartridge. That's the record, and it's the only record, and it's an absence. The honest framing is the one the hollows have always used, which is to say, this is a story the mountains held, and the job is to carry it the way the hollow carried it, not to crack it open and hand over an answer it never had. No one knows what took those men, and the not knowing is the part the hollow could never put down. We keep telling it because the stills running is the one image in it that won't resolve, and the stories that last are the ones that refuse to close. A solved mystery is a file a man can shut, and a shut file is a thing he never opens again. An unsolved one is a door left standing open in the dark, and a door like that doesn't let you sleep. And that's the point, because the 8 men deserve a door that doesn't let the hollow sleep. The eeriest detail is the one that defeats every explanation, and that's the whole reason the hollow could never let it go, and the whole reason we can't either. 8 men gone, no struggle, and the stills still running. And every story the valley built broke on those same 2 facts and left the door open. That's the through line of the whole thing, and it's the part that has kept the story alive for 120 years without anyone needing to dress it up. It isn't really about 8 men, in the end. It's about the kind of place that can take 8 people in the middle of their work and leave the work still going, the coffee still warm, the coat still on the branch. It's as if the world looked away for a moment, and when it looked back, the men were gone, and everything else was exactly where they left it. That's the thing the hollow knew, and the map never will. And it's the thing you carry out of a story like this, whether you meant to or not. The hollow kept its secret, and the stills kept running, and that's all anyone ever really knew. If you want more stories the mountains tried to keep quiet, subscribe and share this one with someone who needs to hear it, because the best way to keep a legend alive is to keep telling it where the firelight reaches.